coming and welcome to this new seminar series, which we've entitled ESI Challenge of the Month Talk. And this is really taking over the ESI State of the Art Talk, which were really successful, but which really had a focus on the academic's career. And we're trying to make it more relevant and of interest to the broader community of researchers across the university. And we hope that we can do so by focusing more on a challenge that really speaks to all of us within our own discipline. So for this inaugurating this first seminar series is Dr. Sarah Crowley, who's a senior lecturer in human geography and animal geography. Sarah's part of the Department of Earth and Environmental Science on this Penryn campus. She's an anthrozoologist, an animal geographer, and an environmental social scientist who focuses on investigating human relationships with non-human animals. Sarah did some of her studying at the University of Chester and of Wales before obtaining a PhD here in bioscience and geography. That's what it was called, it's true. And she's never been able to leave since. Thank you, Sarah, for really opening this new seminar series, and up to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me open the new ESI Challenge of the Month. I think I have a clicker. I am going to talk to you today about the challenge of negotiating animal management in a changing world. So it's actually multiple challenges in one, so I've cheated slightly. But the talk I'm giving today is about species belonging. So it's about the concept of belonging as we apply it to animals. And I'm going to start with what is this going to work? It's not going to work. I'm doing it here. I'm going to start with an interactive session. You didn't know you were getting an interactive session, did you? And the people online should actually also be able to join in with this. So you can use your phone and you can go to menti.com, just like that, type it in your bar, and it'll ask you for a code. And you can put in this little code and you can answer these questions. Now, it's a very binary question that I've given you. I've given you a list of species. It should be mammals before birds, so that's a good start. Let's start. Okay. This is what happens when you use technology. It goes, no, I don't want to do mammals. Well, we'll do birds. Birds is fine. So sure. We'll do birds. It might give you birds, it might give you mammals, but it'll give you some options. And the point is actually in doing the exercise, because this is not a question of your knowledge. This is a question of your perception and your response and your reaction as much as it is your knowledge. So what I'm really hoping is that when people have been through this little list of some pictures will start appearing to show where people place these lovely birds on the spectrum. We'll have a couple of minutes to do it.
The mammals do work on your...
Yeah, that's good. You just can't see them, apparently.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there we go. Look at that. There we go. So that's working fine. This is what I was hoping for. So... Oh, of course, yes, it's 8995 2007. Hopefully those online can do this as well. So you can see that we've got a bit of a mixture of views on these various species, as one might. And so what we actually expect is, if you look at the bars here, it's pretty self-explanatory that anything far to the right, people are generally agreeing on its belonging in Britain, and anything far to the left, people are kind of disagreeing on. So it's bad news for our national animal, which is being deemed thoroughly not to belong in Britain. But it's good news for the mole, which, as we'll see later, is heavily persecuted. So it's quite an interesting selection of things. And then the ones that we can see that there's some kind of tension around, let's say, or some perhaps disagreement around, are the ones in the middle. So the domestic cat, a classic area of controversy, as many of you will know, and also the European bison, which also we're going to talk a little bit about later. So most of these will be talked about briefly at some point in this presentation. So interesting. Let's have a quick look at birds. So now I've moved the slide on, I'm hoping that it will also move you on to birds. Do you get that option?
Let's wait.
It's waiting for me to say something when I actually already have. Technology. No luck?
It hasn't changed slides yet.
Yeah. I mean, we can all see that I have. I can all see that. Okay, well, we'll assume that it's worked fine and that the same goes for this. And so for the people in the room, and people online can make your own choices, but the people in the room, let's have a show of hands. Does the common pheasant, but also, there's no judgment here on your decisions. Does the common pheasant belong in Britain? Hands up if yes. A few, okay. The mute swan, that's the white one. The ring-necked parakeet. Oh, there's some wavering. The white stork.
Yeah.
Okay, just over half there. The feather pigeon. Yeah, there's some uncertainty, but most of you. And the Egyptian goose. Yeah, so you'd think that clues in the name are actually quite well established in Britain, but the question is not are they established in Britain, it's whether they belong. Okay, so thank you for indulging me with that. But this is to kind of illustrate to you the challenge that I'm mostly dealing with. That's just one version of it. But there's several challenges associated with animal management, particularly wildlife, but also domestic animal management. And these are some of them. So which animals do we protect or let live? Which animals do we kill or let die in the terms of biopolitics? How do we manage the behavior of animals ostensibly under our control? So that's domestic species or species in captivity. And how do we respond to species when they're on the move? So when they're introduced or reintroduced or shifting range or being assisted in colonizing a new area due to climate change. And the political side of it is who gets to decide the answers to those questions. So because I am at least half human geographer, I'm going to give you a little bit of theory to start off with. And we're going to talk a little bit about the place of animals. And this is something that my undergraduates get in third year, which is thinking about how we make decisions about where animals are placed conceptually, spatially, and temporally. So if we use the example of the wolf and the domestic dog here, then we've got the idea that we have spatial ideas about where these animals might be. So for the wolf, we think that they may belong in Europe, in North America, in parts of Asia. For the dog, they're pretty much associated being with wherever people are. Okay, so slightly different conceptions there. But also, we expect wolves to be in the wild for the most part. We expect to encounter wolves outside, away from human activity, whereas we'd expect to be dogs to be associated with human activity. We also have a temporal idea of where animals belong. This is showing a really good example in wolf because several hundred years ago, they were very much deemed not to belong anywhere at all and heavily persecuted. And then in recent years, decades, the wolf has had a bit of a renaissance, both conceptually and in its population, and that has allowed it to re-establish in places. And that's partly to do with changing cultural conceptions over time as to whether or not the wolf belongs in certain places. And so they're all linked together, and a lot of this is to do also with these concepts we have about what belongs where and to whom and why. So wolves, we think, mostly belong in the wild. Domestic dogs maybe belong with humans. But do domestic dogs belong in the wild? And can you keep a wolf as a pet? Are also contested questions in animal management. So a key concept that we use in anthrozoology when we're thinking about things like things being out of place is Mary Douglas's matter out of place, where she used the concept of purity and also of pollution. And she talked about the idea of soil being soil when it's outside the home, but when it's tracked into the home, it becomes dirt. And that's because it's changed where it is and our conception of its place has changed. We can also think about this in relation to all kinds of things. I haven't emptied this can, but if you look at it here, it's a can. I'm going to very, very carefully put it on the floor. Now it's on the floor, it's rubbish. So we can change our conception of something depending on its place and our concept of where it belongs. And so when something is in a place that we're not expecting it to be, in our framework of where we want things or expect things to be, it becomes matter out of place. And it becomes a conceptual problem for us. This is a problem that underpins lots of the things that I'm going to talk about. So the rest of the theory here is to do with dualisms, because as I gave you a very binary decision as to whether things belonged or did not belong, when actually it's probably much more complicated than that. What we also have is a lot of dualisms that we use to organize where we think animals belong. And you may have used one or more of these in your assessment of your mammals and birds. But if we use the example of the rabbit, hands up if the rabbit is native to Britain. So no one thinks the rabbit is native to Britain, but it is nevertheless treated as if it is native to Britain. In most of our cultural world, we have Peter Rabbit, we have rabbit stew. We kind of treat the rabbit as if it is a native species. It isn't protected, which we'll come on to later, and it is considered to be sort of a common resident of Britain, if not formally native. So we also have this dualism between wild and domestic. Rabbits, wild or domestic? Both, exactly, they are both. And the way that we tell the difference is often contextual, right? So we do have both wild and domestic rabbits, but we use space often to, and also kind of characteristics to figure out which one we want to classify that animal as. So a couple of years ago, my husband was driving home and he saw a black and white rabbit sitting at the side of the road. And he thought, that's somebody's pet rabbit, because he didn't think that that was a wild rabbit sitting at the side of the road because of the way that it looked and the place that it was in and the behavior that it had. So he's able to make that kind of classification, which meant that he stopped, caught the rabbit, and went to find out who it belonged to, which he wouldn't have done probably if it had been a little brown rabbit like this one sitting at the side of the road. I mean, maybe he would, but he probably wouldn't have had much luck with it. So we also have this distinction between whether we protect something or treat it as a pest, which is also, if we think about rabbits, we perhaps protect them if they're our pets. But if they're wild rabbits, they're generally in this country classified formally as a pest, which means that they can be shot, managed, and have other various things done to them. Of course, in their native range in Iberia, where they are near threatened, they are protected, and there are organizations set up to protect exactly the same animal, but in a different place and in a different context. So what we end up with is animals like rabbits, but also like pretty much all of the others that I'm going to talk to you about for the remainder of this talk, which are called liminal animals. And this is a word that I use quite a lot and I'm very fond of. It has two meanings. It can relate to a kind of transitional stage of a process, and sometimes that's true for animals as well. But actually, I'm using the second definition. These are animals that are on the boundary. They're the species in between. They're on a threshold between one thing and another, and not everybody agrees on which side they fall and how they should be treated. And because not everybody agrees on that, we end up with conflicts, contestations, and various other negotiations around how to manage those animals. So for the rest of this talk, now I've given you the theoretical background, I'm going to go through some various pieces of work that I've done over the past 10 years or so around different species, and some of the work I'm doing now to give you some ideas about how we do research on these liminal animals, but also what kind of we found out and what contributions we've made in this area. So, some of you will have heard this several times. I apologise because this is the very first case study that I did as part of my PhD back in 2015. This is the parakeet, the monk parakeet at the top, the ringneck parakeet at the bottom, and these are often a source of contestation as to their belonging. The two terms that I like to use to demonstrate the contestation here is the term at the top from the New Scientist, who called them the little green alien invaders, or the London Wildlife Trust, who called them as British as curry, which indicates partly that the ringneck parakeet in the south comes from the Himalayas, from North India, but also this idea that these birds are immigrants, in a sense, animal immigrants that were introduced here about 35 years ago now, and to different extents, the monk parakeet has now been eradicated, but the ringneck parakeet is well established in the country and in multiple other countries now. So I was looking at the management of the monk parakeet, and I was looking through the tools that the Great Britain Non-Native Species Secretariat, which is a very long name, used to determine the risk that these birds would pose. And they look at their history, and they look at the impacts that they've had, and they look at their where they've come from and what they've done in those places. And as a result of that, these birds were designated officially as out of place and risky, potentially posing a threat to particularly infrastructure because they build nests. But what they found when there was an attempt to control these birds, actually eradicate these birds, was a great deal of resistance to that, even though the birds had only been established for about 25 years. And the resistance was from those who had a different way of deciding whether something belonged. And rather than using these kinds of systematic approaches to impacts and natural history, they were instead using their own experiences and their relations with that bird to determine whether or not it belonged. So when there was an attempt to eradicate the monk parakeet, we had a great deal of opposition in two places in southeast England. There's some protesters there with their Stop the Parakeet Cull signs back in 2011. And there was quite a lot of surprise about this, because for those interested in the management, it seems self-evident that this species did not belong and that it was a risk to other species and to infrastructure. But the kind of vehemence of opposition was quite striking to them. And one of my jobs as a PhD student was to try and understand what the root cause of that opposition was. But one of the first things that I found was actually that this wasn't a new story. This isn't the first time that this had happened, because back in 1988, an attempt to remove monk parakeets from Chicago had resulted in the same kind of opposition, these lovely T-shirts, and also, quotes such as "We are a nation of immigrants, and so are they." This is a very different way of thinking about whether something belongs. When we look at New Jersey, we had a small group of very committed individuals who put in a lot of effort to gain legal protection for the monk parakeet when they were threatened with removal from New Jersey. This is back in 2004. Oh, there was another one. Did it skip over? Oh yeah, there we go. And there also a small population right up in Oregon, very north of Oregon, were removed from an establishment there. A great deal of protest around that, and said, quote, that they're more than just birds to us, they're part of our community. So these are hints, right? These are indications that people are not seeing parakeets as alien invaders in this scenario. So from this, I started, and with some other work that I've been doing since, I've started thinking about this concept of a wild attachment. And a wild attachment is where people become associated with a wild individual animal or population based on slightly different things than we might expect. So based on their charisma, obviously these are very charismatic animals, and it does help if you're charismatic, but also based on the interactions they have. So material interactions, the physical kind of day-to-day ways in which they interact, and also semiotic interactions. So that's the meaning of the interactions. So if you think about those comparisons with immigrants, for example, the meaning that those interactions carry. But also this can become so extensive that you can have the incorporation of wild populations into human identities at multiple scales. And so you end up with places like Chicago having the monk parakeets of Chicago, Brooklyn parrots, and you had this idea that Borehamwood in Hertfordshire was the place that you could find parakeets. And this goes way beyond parakeets. There are lots of places like this. If you think of Boat of Garton, the Osprey village in Scotland, there's the crocodile village in India. There are countries, counties, communities, individuals who become very closely associated with these groups. And this is what I mean by wild attachment. It's a different way of understanding how something belongs beyond its kind of natural history and legal designation. So I also spent some time working on reintroduced species. So another kind of liminal space where a species hasn't been present in an area for a really long time and has then been introduced. So I was following what we referred to as the Great British Beaver Debate, following the discovery of beavers on the River Otter in 2014. And as part of that work, I started looking at other ways in which people were talking about beavers as belonging in Britain. And we talked about this in terms of non-human citizenship, because some of the ways in which people talk about reintroduced species and introduced species is comparable to the way in which people talk about citizenship. So there are different ways of gaining citizenship. So I've got the human and the animal on there as well. So for humans, it might be your ancestry. You can gain citizenship of a place because you have ancestors who were from there. For animals, it tends to be indigeneity. So this is this idea of nativeness. Is it native to that place? But you can also have birthright. You can gain citizenship through birthright. And it was argued in the case of the beavers that because kits had been born in the wild in Devon, they were born in the wild, this idea of wildness, that they therefore belonged because they had been born here. So they became sort of native through that process, as well as having ancestral indigeneity. And then there was a third argument, which was this idea of integration. So of course, in Britain, if you are very fortunate and have the right circumstances, you can apply for a citizenship test and you have to demonstrate that your knowledge of the place, but you also have to kind of be a good immigrant and integrate well into society. And this is very true also of introduced and reintroduced species. What you do and who you get on with, and this idea that you can become naturalized, like the rabbit, is quite prominent. So the relationship with the community that you're entering into really matters as well. So in this case, it was very interesting because actually campaigners on behalf of the beavers used all three of these arguments, different people at different times, but all three of these arguments were used simultaneously to argue that beavers belonged in Britain. And that turned out to be extremely powerful because as a collective argument, it resulted in effectively an about turn on the part of the government around what was going to happen to these animals, which were originally due to be removed. Instead, it was decided that they could stay as part of a reintroduction trial. So kind of being on parole, I guess. So a citizenship trial that they were allowed to remain under as part of. But it also shows that there's multiple routes to belonging. Okay, so this is another way of thinking about belonging. More recently, I've been working on this species, the white stork. And you might notice that I put the re in brackets, and that's because, quite interestingly, as we were doing this research, we found that among ornithologists, there's a bit of an unsettled history around white storks as to whether they were previously breeding in Britain or not. So there's good archaeological evidence that white storks have been present in Britain, and they have been on and off over time. But whether they had previously been an established breeding bird is still not entirely clear. And some of the evidence that's used to argue that they used to be here is things like the names of places, the names of pubs, but then we have lots of red lions. It's not 100% clear. So what evidence do we use to say that something has belonging to a place? What evidence do we use to say something is native? And what evidence is enough? So how much archaeological evidence do we need of the white stork being here to say that it's a reintroduction? And it does matter in some ways, because there's a big argument that species shouldn't be introduced to a place because they could have all sorts of unforeseen effects. But there's a lot of desire to have species reintroduced to a place to restore a previous ecology. So it does sort of matter to some people whether or not they really were here in the past. Nevertheless, because they are a regular visitor to Britain as well, they have been, there's no license required. So these have been reintroduced and they didn't have to go through this process in a formal manner. What's really interesting, though, is that most of the reasoning for reintroducing the white stork was not to do with the white stork's conservation. They're actually doing fine. It was because they are a very charismatic bird and people wanted to use them to connect people with nature and to connect people with the idea of having more sort of abundant charismatic wildlife. So the reason for that reintroduction is quite unusual. And rather than being kind of a restoration based on we know the species used to be here, we killed them all, and now we're bringing them back, which is sort of the beaver narrative. With white storks, that narrative isn't quite so clear. And the reasoning for their restoration is to do with engagement. And there is some sort of questioning also as to how good a reason is that for introducing something. So that's something that we, my co-authors and I were discussing quite a lot. And as a result of that, we've set up something called the People and Conservations Translocation. I can't even say it. The People and Conservation Translocations Network, which is funded by an ESI policy support fund originally, and met last year for the first time. And we're working on a piece at the moment, which is around motivations for conservation translocations, which are always assumed to be ecological. But actually, once you start getting into the case studies, it turns out many of them aren't solely ecological. There's a lot more going on. They might have political reasons, economic drivers, social drivers, cultural reasons for doing stuff. And so we're trying to broaden the scope of understanding around translocations to think beyond the ecological. So this one was a contested species, even in my little very non-scientific survey that I did earlier. The European bison, there's no historical record of this in Britain. There was a steppe bison a very, very, very long time ago, which is a slightly different species. But it's kind of acknowledged that that's the case, that it has been introduced under controlled conditions for functional purposes because of the ecosystem roles that it plays because of the processes that it performs in terms of forests especially. But this is quite an interesting one as a liminal animal because it has been reintroduced, but it's not in the wild in the same way that beavers or even white storks might be considered. They're very closely managed by people. They're fenced in, I think, so much more like livestock. And this brings them into a slightly different form of liminality, which is the binary between the wild and the domestic. So through mostly not myself, but via some very excellent PhD students who've been doing some work on the Scottish wildcat, also known as the European wildcat, because they are the same species. And it's generally agreed that wildcats belong in the wild. That's not too contested on the whole. But one of the things that my colleague Nell found when she was doing her research in this area is that the really complicated bit was deciding what made a wildcat a wildcat. Because in Scotland, the wildcat is extremely threatened. The main reason it's threatened is because it hybridizes with domestic cats. And so many of the cats in Scotland are hybrid domestic cats, wildcats, more wildcat, less wildcat. And I think a few years ago, I think 2017, there was a paper declaring the Scottish wildcat functionally extinct because of the extent of this hybridization with domestic cats. So if you're out in the field and you're trying to determine if the animal that you found is a wildcat or a domestic cat, and that does matter because if it's a wildcat, it's highly protected, and if it's a domestic cat, you can shoot it. So those things do really matter. You have to have a range of things in the background that are informing your decision as to whether this species belongs in this place. The main one that has been used is the appearance. So they have a pelage score, which I think I have a picture of here, that you can use to differentiate between the markings of a wildcat on the left and a domestic cat on the right, and you can use all these things. Pretty difficult as a barrel of a gun, I think. But generally, if you're talking about captured cats and what to do with captured cats, then you could use this. There's also a genetic test. You can find a good picture of genetic test apart from that. There's also genetic testing that you can use to determine whether markers are more wildcat or more domestic cat. And generally, there's a threshold of 7. I think it's 70% on that particular within that group of people at community of practice. There's a 70% assumption that 70% wildcat is wildcat enough. But different people argue for different percentages. There's its behavior, so it depends what it's up to, where it's so whether it's kind of acting like a wildcat would be, acting like a domestic cat would be, partly to do with location as well. So partly to do with where they're found, how far away from human settlements, and whether they're kind of living independently as a wildcat would, or perhaps more in relationship with people as a domestic cat might be expected to. But as you can see, it's not entirely clear cut. And there's an extra level of this as well, because now we're looking at reintroducing wildcats into other regions in England and Wales. So there are a couple of projects investigating that possibility at the moment. But the question then becomes, well, firstly, can it still be called a Scottish wildcat if it's in the rest of Britain, or is it going to have a bit of a rebrand? But also questions about reintroductions in Scotland, whether they should be breeding wildcats from European stock, or whether they should be using the very limited Scottish wildcat stock that they have to be breeding from that, because if they're coming from Europe, are they really Scottish wildcats anymore? These kinds of questions have been asked, but also if you're introducing them to Wales and the Southwest, which are areas under consideration at the moment, there's a lot of questions then about the possibility of the same thing happening and then becoming hybridized with domestic cats. Because one of the key things about reintroductions is that if you're going to reintroduce something, you have to try and remove the thing that originally caused the problem in the first place. And at the moment, that's not necessarily been removed because domestic cats are in all of these places. So this is a very much live issue at the moment. And it's live because of these guys. So I've done a few years' work on domestic cats. Those cat fans among you will be disappointed to know that I'm not going to talk about much of that today, but I'm going to talk about this kind of theoretical piece of work that we did around domestic cats, which identified why they're such a conceptual problem for us. We refer to it as wild companions. And this is because, well, domestic cats fall into two categories all the time. Because they have a relatively long period of a domestic relationship with people, they're generally considered a domestic animal. But unlike other domestic animals, many domestic animals they're completely capable of functioning independently as wild animals. They have retained most of the characteristics of the wildcats from which they originate. So they can hunt, live independently, and effectively don't need us. Right. So you have an animal that is extremely tightly interwoven with human culture and society, as a pet and as a kind of part of human communities, human homes, as a domestic animal. But at the same time, this is an animal that is completely capable of living as a wild animal. And because of that, it does two things. Firstly, it hunts, mainly it hunts. And so that's considered a good thing and has been considered a good thing for a long time. If, for example, you live on a farm and need to control rodents, we consider that a pest controller. But if your domestic cat is on a nature reserve and killing sparrows and other endangered birds, then it's a pest rather than a pest controller, because it's in a different place, in a different context. And so it changes how we understand the belonging of that animal. And cats manage to be both of these things at the same time. They're both companion animals and wild animals in a way that most of our other domestic animals are not. And that liminality, that sitting between those categories, is fundamental to many of the management disputes about what to do with domestic cats. Because of their role in human society, there's so much concern about the management of feral cats, for example, because people don't want to see cats killed or harmed. But also because of their role as a human, well, originally probably a human commensal, but kind of a human companion, people feel responsible for the impact that they have on other animals because they probably wouldn't be here if we weren't here. So both of those things, both of those disputes kind of rely on this very confusing classification. And so then we have this other question, which I haven't got an answer to just yet. But the question that comes up is, if a species has a historical relationship with humans, a relationship of domestication in this case, should they always be controlled by humans? Because this is the suggestion that often comes up around domestic cats. Is domestic cats must be kept indoors. Domestic cats must be kept under control. If you have feral cats, they must be controlled and killed. And the reason that that assumption is there is because of that domestic relationship. And the underlying assumption of that domestic relationship is because we do have a relationship with them, that we should control and be responsible for them. And that is a challenge that has not yet been resolved. And then it leads to this kind of bigger question about where do domestic animals belong, and that's something that I'm looking at in some other areas as well in relation to dogs, because we have these questions about when we have domestic animals and they're no longer wild animals, but they're operating in wild environments and wild spaces, like dogs in nature reserves or like cats in gardens, then is that a place that they belong? And if they don't belong there, then where do they belong? Only in houses? Forever? And we also have very different views on that internationally, because traditionally in this country, and very much so in other countries, domestic dogs roam freely like cats do. So this is a culturally specific view as to where animals belong as well, and it varies depending on where you are and over time. I did review a paper which used the phrase, the domestic cat is a globally non-native species. And I took issue with that statement because it makes no sense, because unless they're from the moon, they cannot in fact be a globally non-native species. But I understood the point that the authors were trying to make. But the point that the authors were trying to make is they're a domestic species. And because of that close relationship with humans, they don't belong in the wild. That's the point that they were trying to make. But the only language that they had for it, the only conceptual language they had for it, was the idea that they were a non-native species. And so they became globally non-native. And that's sometimes what happens conceptually to domestic animals, is that they have no place at all beyond the household. Okay, so we're coming to the end, but there's one final category that I want to cover, which is the protected versus pest dichotomy. And it's not always a dichotomy, as most of these aren't, but it's treated as such. And I'm using the wind in the willows for this, because every piece of research I've done, at some point, someone has mentioned the wind in the willows. And I never read the wind in the willows as a kid, and I don't quite get why it's quite such a big deal, but it is culturally a huge deal. Okay, so if you haven't read Wind in the Willows and you want to understand something about the British culture, then now's the time. The two of the key characters in Wind in the Willows are Ratty, who is in fact not a rat but a water vole, and Moll, who is in fact a mole. And these are good illustrations of how it's not just about nativeness or domestic domesticity that can affect the liminality of an animal. So water voles have been declining for a long time, but particularly since the introduction of the American mink earlier this century, and that has created a great deal of concern about their future, and that has resulted in their quite high levels of protection of conservation initiatives working towards protecting the water vole. And so I think about, if we think back to the idea of wild attachment, and you have this animal that was previously very common and part of people's lives, and the stories of the water voles going pop when they people used to go out along rivers. You have something, a kind of attachment to this animal that's kind of inspired by loss, because I imagine that historically people didn't really think about water voles all that much. And then when they're not there anymore, then they become much more valuable. In contrast, mole, who is probably like the nicest character in Winter of the Willows, is it's a common animal, but we don't know actually a great deal about it. A report that I dug out that Robbie had contributed to a few years ago said that they were data deficient in all it's counties, that should read, not countries. In all counties of England, they were data deficient. So we don't actually know exactly how many moles there are. But they're assumed to be very common, and they're classified as a pest, which means that they have no protection at all. It also means that they can be killed in a variety of fairly unpleasant ways, much like rats and mice. And this continues perhaps more than you would think. There's a high level of mole control across the country that goes on anywhere, basically, that molehills are considered a nuisance. Perhaps for agriculture, there's concerns about their role in silage production, but also race courses, gardens, anywhere that molehills might be considered unsightly, moles are killed. And this is quite an interesting difference between these two species, because effectively this is an understanding of belonging that's based on their behavior and their signs, right? Water voles are kind of harmless little guys that plop into the water, but moles, firstly, they're out of sight, out of mind, so you don't really see them. But when you do see them, what you see is what they leave behind, which is molehills, which people find annoying. So we have these kind of beneficial versus problem animal discourses around that creates the mole as this very liminal animal that doesn't really. It's surprising that we have a native mammal that continues to be treated in this way, actually. And I'm currently working on a grant proposal with the National Trust, who are interested in changing their policy around mole control from a traditional policy of mole removal whenever they were considered a problem to the reverse, where the policy is not to control unless there's a very good justification for it. And so we're doing some work on perceptions around moles and their control, and we're hoping to, if we get some funding, that I think will perhaps shed some light on the kind of hidden story of the European mole in Britain. So the final thing I want to talk about is this project I've been working on with some folk in New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. But it's based at the Cawthon Institute in New Zealand with its partners. And it's called Fish Futures. And the aim of the project is to make freshwater fisheries management, which is a very complex and contested issue in New Zealand, more joined up, more just, and more sustainable. So I won't talk, I'm happy to talk to anyone at any time about the rest of this project, but I'm just talking about one piece of work that we're doing in this, which is based on this idea that we've been working with Department of Conservation, with Fish and Game, and with 3 Maori iwi about the value and knowledge systems that are different and their ideas about what belongs in New Zealand, which is very contested, and how these different concepts are also differentially played out through an uneven distribution of power. So some of these people get more say in management activities than others, simply put. So we have been working on species belonging as a kind of fundamental component of this. And there's some of my team. It's not my team, it's their team. I am on the team. But this is a piece of work that we've been doing, and I've just said it's a work in progress, so I'm sure you wouldn't, but please don't share this one, partly because it's a joint effort that we're working on at the moment about developing a new conceptual framework about what it might mean for a species to belong that will help people think through some of the complicated stuff that I've been talking about in a management setting. So this idea about nativeness, this idea about wildness, what I previously referred to as kind of integration, but this idea of contributing, so what benefits or costs those animals bring, not just to humans, but also to other species in the area that it is. And also this idea of right relations, which has been really, we've been really helped with by the contribution of Nick Rio, who is our Ojibwe team member, who talks about relations with animals in quite a different way, thinking about kinship and a history of responsibility to your kin. And so these kinds of relations that actually they're not dissimilar from these wild attachments that I was talking about earlier, where relations aren't based on natural history or based on kind of concepts of wild or domestic, but based on the kinds of relationships and experiences that people have with the animals that they're thinking about managing. So that's a current work in progress that I'm very pleased to be part of. This is good because we're widening the pool of people involved. But there is the question of who should be the arbiters of what belongs, and should it just even be people is the other question. Should it go beyond that? And what happens if it's determined that there is nowhere a species belongs, as we've seen with some people's views on domestic animals? But then I think where I've come to with this is, actually the real question is there a final designation to be made? Do we have to decide once and for all that something does or doesn't belong? Or is it more that we're in an ongoing process of negotiation and it doesn't have a final answer, but the challenge is to keep negotiating? So this is a little diagram I did of the various bits and pieces that my work is covering at the moment, split up in relation to those different sections we went through there. So you can also see I've got the names of my PhD students and the other projects that I'm working on here. I've got Jessica's here. Wave Jessica is working on parakeets. Sean's not here today, but she's working on wildcats, carrying on and some work that Tom Dandy has just finished doing. Gavin is here. Give us a wave, Gavin. He's back there. He's working on recreational disturbance, which includes dogs in the environment. And then Emma's here, the way over there we go, who is working with Dave Hodgson and me on feral cat demography. And then Josh is here. Still reluctantly waving. He's working on carnivore recovery, which may sometimes be under this problem or pest species category. So we've got lots of stuff going on. Happy to talk to you about any of those things. So with that, thank you very much. Lots of people to acknowledge. I decided not to cover the screen with it. There are probably some people who I've forgotten, so big apologies if I have. And there's my email address, or you can come and find me. I live in Peter Lanyon, opposite Lecture 4.
Thanks for a fabulous talk.
Apparently I have to stop sharing this so we can see people online.
So we have time for questions. Right, Karen?
Thanks, Sarah. That was really great talk. I really enjoyed it. So I was really fascinated in terms of the potential links between social injustices and some animal injustices, and how those discourses into politics.
Yeah.
I'm interested in knowledge controversy, but also how things like racism and colonialism might come into discourses around who belongs or what animal belongs.
Yeah.
So thinking about work that I did a long time ago on bees, alien species get sort of racialized sometimes. The Asian hornet is a problem.
Yeah.
Is it more of a problem in people's minds because it's Asian rather than European? So I just wondered if you've noticed any of those sorts of discourses playing out in terms of the animal.
Yeah, I mean, so the discussion around language has been going on in invasion science for a long time. It's not resolved. Every now and again, someone will write another paper on it, and someone will write a rebuttal, and that pretty much is all that happens. But I think but towards the end of my PhD, I think how I come to understand it was that it is sometimes a genuine problem. The example I used in the introduction to my PhD was the phrase when Himalayan balsam was being controlled, people started using the phrase balsam bashing. And you may know that not that long prior to that, there was a much less pleasant phrase used for immigrant communities, which basically the same phrase with different word in front of it. And so that was, I think that's real. Like, but I don't think it's. I think the thing is, I don't think it's intentional necessarily. I don't think that those things are being picked up by people concerned about Himalayan balsam in order to do that. But they use the same language, and that itself is the problem. If that makes sense. They don't necessarily mean to create that parallel, but in people's minds it does create that parallel, and that does make it a problem. And probably about halfway through my PhD, I switched to using introduced species, actually, because invasive itself has tons of connotations, partly about intent as well, because people tend to invade somewhere with intent, and most of the time species being introduced into a place is not intentional on their part, but introduced is pretty neutral. So I think it's important to be careful about language, and I think that especially historically, there has been a lack of care in some parts of invasion science around that language. It has been recognised. I think sometimes the more likely the places I've heard that haven't really been in the scientific world, though it's been sort of out there where people aren't really thinking about what they're doing. But yes, because they come from different places, but the narratives converge, and I think that's where the problem arises with that. As regards, so the work in New Zealand has been really interesting because we do see a lot of difference between the way that Maori categorize and think about animals, how that's treated, versus the scientific discourse of the Department of Conservation and Fish and Game. So, you know, you've got different interests there, obviously, but Fish and Game introduced a great deal of species like trout and deer, and they're kind of known to be introduced but considered game species. Whereas other introduced species, such as the Kiore, the Pacific rat, which were introduced by the Maori, are considered pests. So you've got some really complicated stories around power imbalances and politics that I have been learning about as part of that project. Because pretty much all of my work, apart from the New Zealand project, is focused in the UK, the first issue is the one that I'm more familiar with. But yeah, we're doing some really interesting stuff around the idea of species belonging in a post-colonial colonial context now, and also with Nick Greer, our Ojibwe friend, about things there. I think one of the most interesting stories I've heard from that is about the reintroduction of Pacific salmon, which has been a relationship that's been built between two indigenous communities, one in Western United States, I think in California, and with Maori, who have Pacific salmon, and Pacific salmon are effectively almost extinct in the region in North America. And they're arranging a reintroduction program between those two indigenous communities, because of the kind of introduction and then kind of the reinstatement. That's a really interesting story that's kind of unfolding at the moment, that doesn't rely on all of these kind of more Western concepts.
Really interesting. Thank you so much. Has a question?
Oh no. Hi, Ruby. Can you? I think you're on mute.
Can't get it to switch on. Hang on.
No, I can hear you. I can hear you now.
Okay, good. Thanks, Sarah. That's a great talk. It's good to hear about the New Zealand work, and actually it was a thought on that. And you even mentioned the species that I was going to ask you about. So in that New Zealand typology of how animals belong and how you revisit which ones are considered as belonging, it occurred to me that with the Kiore, I'm pretty sure that most of the iwi consider that Kiore, the Pacific or Polynesian rat, is valued and belongs because it was brought with them. So it's the deliberate, in this case, transport of the animal with the early arrivals. And I think there's a lot of discussion about whether or not they were on the boat, and I think there are some depictions of them having been on the boat, and it's that's important in terms of how the Maori consider that they belong because they were brought with them, as opposed to kind of coming along accidentally or arriving later, as with the other two rat species in New Zealand. So I thought it's an interesting addition to that typology, that they belong because they were brought with.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know, it would be worth, I think we'll use that as a discussion point actually, because there is a master's student out there doing some work on Curie at the moment, because what I have learned is that the Curie is a Katia katanga, I think is the word, which is a treasure species.
Yeah, Tonga, yeah.
But oh yeah, Katia katanga is guardian and Tonga is the treasure. So guardian of the treasure and the treasure. So but it's not for all iwi. And I think sometimes this gets lost sometimes when we have discourse around, Indigenous people, is that, among the Maori, different groups have different taonga. And so for some groups, the Curie is not that interesting or important, but for others, it's really very significant. And you're right, it's because of that story of arrival. It has a arrival story associated with it that's really significant to certain groups. For others, one of the groups has that we've been working with has the crayfish, so the native crayfish as a townland. So they're different, and so that's in some ways another interesting thing, is this the kind of flattening sometimes of the complexity of these relations. But I think it probably, once we work on those categories a bit more, I've got a feeling it's going to come in that kind of relational, right relations last bit in there about about your history and your culture and your experiences with that species. But yeah, it is interesting that it's part of the story of their arrival, because actually Fish and Game would probably argue that the brown trout is the same for European arrival, because it was brought as part of acclimatization societies to make them feel at home when they settled in New Zealand, because it was thought that there weren't any fish in the rivers of New Zealand, because most of the native galaxids are very, very small and quite cryptic, and so for a long time they didn't actually think that the rivers had fish in them. And so they brought their own fish to stock the river so that they could fish the same way they did at home. So lots going on in New Zealand. Thanks, Robbie.
Any other question?
Is there another one online? Can't see any hands up here.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, again, for a really great talk.
Thank you. Thank you online. Oh, you can't see me. I have to go this way. Thanks, people online.